In the Paris of 1890 to 1914, a small group of women lived in a separate economic universe. They were not aristocrats. They were not wives. They were the grandes horizontales, and they were among the wealthiest women in Europe. La Belle Otero amassed a fortune in pearls worth $25 million, turning down emperors at the Folies Bergères. Liane de Pougy published scandalous memoirs from her private chateau, while Emilienne d'Alençon bankrupted 3 princes before becoming Coco Chanel's very first client. But here is what the history books often omit. These women didn't just seduce power. They quietly controlled it, negotiated contracts with royalty, and built property portfolios that rivaled industrialists. Then, in 1914, their entire world vanished overnight, not because they made a mistake, but because the system that made them possible collapsed in gunfire and mud. To understand how this world was built and why it shattered so completely, you have to understand what a grande horizontale actually was. The term means great horizontal one, a woman who lounged while dukes and industrialists signed over their fortunes. But behind the pose was a business empire. These women were not simply mistresses. They were among the most photographed, scrutinized, and powerful celebrities of the age. Every afternoon, they drove through the Bois de Boulogne in custom-built carriages, their names in every gossip column. At the opera on Monday nights, the aristocracy might sit in private boxes, but the courtesans occupied the seats that drew every opera glass. They set fashion trends. Liane de Pougy launched a Sapphic bestseller that went through 69 printings in its first year. Emilienne d'Alençon wore Coco Chanel's first hats to the Longchamp races, making a brand before brands existed. And La Belle Otero once entered Maxim so covered in jewels that her rival literally went home to change. And here is the uncomfortable truth. These women were better compensated and more publicly powerful than any legitimate wife. They chose their lovers. To kings, emperors, and dukes, they issued prices. Not requests, prices. In return, they received diamonds, mansions, and a seat at the table of power. They invested in railways. They lived by a single rule. A courtesan does not fall in love with her client. She extracts. She insulates. She plans for the day her beauty fades. But that plan required a specific world, a world of monarchies and horse-drawn carriages, where a leisure class squandered fortunes without consequence. That world was about to be consumed by the industrialized slaughter of World War I. The question this documentary will answer is not simply how these women rose. It is why their entire economic system was built on a foundation of sand, and what happened when the world they manipulated turned on them. So let's begin where all great fortunes begin, with nothing. Carolina Otero was born in 1868 in a village in Galicia, Spain, so poor that her mother had to borrow bread from neighbors. By age 12, she was dancing in the streets for coins. By 14, she had been assaulted by a man who promised to marry her, then abandoned. She carried that wound all the way to Paris. She arrived at 21 with nothing but her face and a talent for making men believe she was doing them a favor. Within 3 years, she was La Belle Otero. She was demanding 5,000 francs just to sit at a man's table. That was roughly the yearly salary of a factory worker. And here is what you must understand about these women. Their origin stories were almost identical. Liane de Pougy was Anne-Marie Chassaigne from a convent in Brittany, pushed into marriage as a teenager, fled her abusive husband, and remade herself so completely that even her childhood friends would not recognize her. Emilienne d'Alençon was born Émilie André in a Parisian tenement, where the walls wept permanently with damp. Her father did menial labor. Her mother took in laundry. Emilienne worked in a market hall and slept on a straw mattress until she discovered that a pretty girl could eat better by trading glances with wealthy men. Notice the pattern. Desperate girlhood, escape from powerlessness, then a calculated metamorphosis. The grandes horizontales were not born into luxury. They built themselves, piece by piece, from nothing. They chose new names as deliberately as a corporation chooses a brand. And like a corporation, they understood that the product was not themselves. It was fantasy. The fantasy of availability to men who had everything, except something they could not purchase with a bank draft. Exclusive access to beauty that charged them for the privilege. But to build that fantasy into an empire required a specific stage. And the stage was Paris in the Belle Époque. The French call it the beautiful era, and they are being selective with their memory. Yes, the Eiffel Tower had risen as a monument to engineering pride. Yes, the metro was slicing tunnels under the boulevards. Yes, artists like Toulouse-Lautrec and Degas were painting the demi-monde in vivid streaks of oil. But beneath the gaslight and the can-can music, there was a rigidly stratified society. A married aristocratic woman could not dine alone in a restaurant. She could not travel without a chaperone. She could not manage her own money. Her entire existence was a negotiation between her father and her husband. A courtesan, by contrast, could do all of these things. She could walk into Maxim's at midnight, sit at her own table, order champagne in her own name, and sign the bill herself. That freedom was worth the social stigma. And for many women of ambition, it was the only path to economic agency that existed. This paradox sat at the heart of the courtesan's power. She was simultaneously the most despised and the most envied woman in the city. Wives spat the word cocotte through clenched teeth, while their husbands emptied their bank accounts to buy her diamond chokers. The Archbishop of Paris thundered against immorality from the cathedral, while the Prince of Wales slipped through a side door of the Folies Bergère to meet her backstage. The hypocrisy was the system, and the courtesans understood the system better than anyone. Now, if you are thinking that this sounds like a simple transaction, sex for money, I need you to set that aside entirely. These women were not street prostitutes. They were strategic operators who managed portfolios of wealthy men the way a hedge fund manager balances high-risk assets. A grande horizontale would customarily be kept by what contemporaries called a cartel, 3 millionaires or 2 dukes, or if she was supremely positioned, a single royal. She would negotiate terms that included a residence, a carriage, servants, a monthly stipend, and jewels as collateral. The jewels were crucial because they were portable, untraceable, and universally convertible to cash. A string of pearls from the German Kaiser could pay for a year's living if the cartel collapsed. La Belle Otero raised this to an art form. She once entered Maxim's on arm with a Russian Grand Duke, wearing a plunge-necked gown and every jewel she had ever been gifted. The effect was blinding. The entire restaurant stopped. Diamond strings layered over ruby necklaces over sapphire chokers, each piece representing a different lover. Liane de Pougy was dining at the opposite end of the room. She watched Otero make her grand entrance, rose quietly, and went home to put on her own jewels. She returned with her entire collection, 48 pieces of imperial-grade stones, and sat down without a word. The two women spent the rest of the evening ignoring each other while the rest of Paris talked about nothing else for a week. This was not vanity. It was a balance sheet displayed on flesh. Each jewel was an asset. The woman who sparkled more brilliantly commanded higher rates. The market was watching. But here is something that will surprise you. The courtesans' relationships to these men were often more honest than the marriages those men had. A wife was expected to pretend love while her husband kept a mistress. A courtesan was under no such obligation. Otero was famous for her bluntness. She once told a journalist, "If a gentleman is seen with me, it strengthens his reputation because then he is considered extremely rich." She understood that her clients were not just purchasing intimacy. They were purchasing status among other men. She was a trophy. Yes, but she was a trophy who set the rules. She chose her lovers. Even to the crowned heads of Europe, she issued her price. Kaiser Wilhelm II sought her attention repeatedly. She accepted, but only on her terms. The King of Serbia proposed. She declined. When asked why, she replied that she preferred men who were less earnest. Emilienne d'Alençon took a different approach. She cultivated an air of fragile innocence that drove men to ruin. She had the peculiar gift of looking like she was about to cry, which made men desperate to cheer her up. They cheered her up with country estates and stables of horses. She bankrupted 3 princes this way, 3 men from Europe's oldest families, who had inherited wealth that had survived revolutions and wars, bleeding it away into Emilienne's silk-lined drawing room. One of them, Prince Achille Murat, the heir of Napoleon's cavalry commander, sold his family's chateau to pay her bills. She thanked him by adding a 4th prince to her rotation. But the emotional detachment did not always hold. Liane de Pougy nearly broke the cardinal rule. She fell in love, not with a man, but with an American heiress named Natalie Clifford Barney, who was 20 years old and defiantly open about her attraction to women. Barney arrived in Paris like a small blonde hurricane, determined to seduce the most famous courtesan in the city. She sent Liane letters. She knelt in gardens. She commissioned a silver chastity belt engraved with roses. Liane, who had built her life on calculation, found herself completely undone. Their affair became the subject of her Roman Aclef, Idyll Saphique, which you now know, went through 69 printings in a year. The book scandalized Paris, not because it portrayed lesbian love. Paris was used to that, but because it portrayed a courtesan emotionally vulnerable. It violated the first rule of the business: never let them see that you have a heart. The public was riveted. The cartel of male protectors was nervous. A courtesan in love is a courtesan who might stop charging. But the story of these women is not just a story of individual lives. It is a story of an economic structure that was astonishingly fragile. Consider the conditions that had to exist for a courtesan economy to function. First, you needed a leisure class with enormous surplus wealth, the aristocrats and industrialists of the late 19th century, who were sitting on fortunes so large they could not spend the interest fast enough. Second, you needed a social system that kept legitimate women economically powerless, so that the only women who could really engage in the public sphere were those who operated outside legitimacy. Third, you needed a press that could make a courtesan famous, so that the competition remained fierce and the prices remained high. Fourth, you needed weak currencies in the form of jewels, portable, private, and exempt from the scrutiny that would accompany a bank transfer. And fifth, you needed a kind of permanent peace, or at least the illusion of it, because wars disrupt the leisure class and the supply chains of luxury. All 5 conditions were met in Paris in the 1890s. The Belle Époque was a bubble of prosperity built on imperial extraction. French colonies in Africa and Southeast Asia sent rubber, minerals, and agricultural wealth flooding into the metropole. Industrialists like Maurice de Rothschild, who courted Liane de Pougy, were richer than entire nations. They could drop the equivalent of $100,000 on a single evening without affecting their net worth. The newspapers, hungry for content, turned courtesans into celebrities. Their photographs hung in shops. Their carriage drives were mapped in the society pages. Their bon mots were repeated across the continent. When Otero purchased a new pearl, it was front-page news. When Liane changed her hair, fashion magazines followed. This celebrity was a weapon. It allowed courtesans to command higher fees, but it also made them vulnerable. The press that built them could destroy them. Their movements were recorded. Their lovers were catalogued. Their financial standing was public knowledge. They lived in a kind of gilded fishbowl. and they knew that the same aristocrats who worshipped them would drop them the moment they ceased to be fashionable. The Grande Horizontale had a shelf life. Beauty, in that era before advanced cosmetics and plastic surgery, was a depreciating asset. Otero spent hours every day on elaborate beauty rituals, applying cold creams and refusing to smile because she feared wrinkles. She often said, "Women have one mission in life, to be beautiful. When one gets old, one must learn how to break mirrors. I am very gently expecting to die." She said that when she was 40 and considered herself ancient. But the most precarious condition of all was the peace. The courtesan economy depended on a Europe ruled by interrelated monarchs who spent their summers at spas and their winters in ballrooms. They measured their rivalries in hunting parties and naval tonnage, not in artillery shells. The system seemed permanent. It was not. In the spring of 1914, La Belle Otero was 46. She had lost a fortune at the Monte Carlo casino, but remained a legend. Liane de Pougy had married a Romanian prince and was attempting respectability, though gossip followed her like a trained dog. Emilienne d'Alençon was fading, her opium habit beginning to hollow her cheeks, her string of jockeys and lost loves depleting her savings. The younger generation of cocottes was already nipping at their heels. Women like Cleo de Merode, whose demure hairstyle launched 1,000 imitations, and Mata Hari, who danced in veils and mystery. The market was shifting, but the machine was still running. Then, on June 28th of that year, a teenage Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 pistol shots into Archduke Franz Ferdinand's motorcade in Sarajevo. In Paris, the news rated a small item. The summer season continued. The Court of Appeal remained packed with divorce cases. The races at Longchamp drew the usual crowds of parasols and top hats. The Grandes Horizontales took their afternoon drives through the Bois, and their clients argued about whether Germany was really going to mobilize over a Balkan quarrel. It seemed impossible. Civilized nations did not go to war over the death of one archduke in a peripheral province. The cartel of dukes and millionaires assured their courtesans that diplomacy would prevail. But by the end of July, the alliance system had locked into place like a series of dominoes. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend its Slavic ally. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. On August 3, 1914, German troops crossed the border into Belgium. The British Empire, bound by treaty, declared war on Germany. Suddenly, the cosmopolitan world of monarchs and aristocrats who had funded the Grandes Horizontales was at war with itself. The Kaiser who had courted Otero was now the enemy of the Prince of Wales, who had sat in her boudoir. The Russian Grand Dukes who had poured rubies into Paris were recalled to St. Petersburg to prepare their regiments. The Rothschild banking network split along national lines. French millionaires liquidated their assets to buy war bonds. In an instant, the surplus wealth that had funded the courtesan economy was being redirected into artillery shells. But the real collapse was not simply economic. It was epistemological. The war made the entire Belle Époque seem obscene. A woman dripping in jewels while boys were drowning in mud in the Marne became a moral scandal rather than a glamorous sight. The press, which had elevated the courtesans to celebrity, now turned on them. They were suddenly visible as parasites, not power players. The rhetoric of sacrifice and national unity had no room for women who extracted fortunes from idle aristocrats. The social license evaporated. The Grandes Horizontales, who had never loved their public, now found themselves hated by it. So at the moment when they were most vulnerable, aging, overleveraged, their protectors vanishing into uniforms, the ground collapsed under their feet. The question was not whether they would fall. The question was how far. And that is where the second act of this story begins. Not in the jeweled restaurants of Paris, but in the frozen trenches, where their former lovers were dying by the tens of thousands, and in the empty boulevards where the women themselves had to decide whether to adapt, hide, or fade into the shadow that was swallowing an entire world. The war did not arrive in Paris with trumpets. It arrived as silence. The cafes of the Grands Boulevards emptied overnight. The Maxims that had glittered with Otero's jewels now served watery soup to officers on leave. The horses that had pulled courtesan carriages through the Bois were requisitioned by the army. The Bois itself, where afternoon drives had been performances of power, became a training ground for infantry. And the men, the millionaires, the dukes, the princes, vanished into uniforms that would be caked in mud within weeks. For the Grandes Horizontales, the first shock was the sudden absence of their economic base. Their cartels dissolved, not through negotiation, but through mobilization. The Russian Grand Dukes who had layered Otero in sapphires were summoned to lead regiments that would be slaughtered in the Masurian lakes. The German aristocrats who had competed for Émilienne d'Alençon's attention became enemy aliens overnight, their French bank accounts frozen. The Rothschilds, who had showered Liane de Pougy with diamonds, redirected their capital into war bonds. The entire trans-European aristocracy, intermarried, multilingual, borderless, collapsed into nationalist trenches. A courtesan's client list, which had once been a map of European power, became a list of men trying to kill each other. But the economic collapse was only the first wave. The second was the social censure. The French press, which had once chronicled every gown, now published casualty lists. The pages that had featured courtesan scandals now printed letters from soldiers at the front and instructions for knitting socks. In this new moral landscape, the Grande Horizontale was not fashionable. She was an embarrassment. The government launched campaigns against luxury and immorality as undermining the war effort. Prostitution was still tolerated near military camps. But the high courtesan, with her diamonds and her carriage, suddenly looked like a treasonous waste of resources when the nation was rationing bread. Women who had been the most visible symbol of Parisian glamour became the most visible symbol of a world that the war was punishing France for having indulged. Otero felt this acutely. She was still in Paris in August 1914, still wearing her jewels, even as the German army pushed toward the Marne. The hotels that had welcomed her were converting to hospitals. The boulevards were patrolled by soldiers, and the men who might have protected her were either at the front or in hiding. She attempted to maintain her lifestyle, gambling at a few remaining casinos, but the atmosphere was hostile. She heard the word profiteer whispered behind her back. She was not profiteering from the war. She was profiteering from the peace, and the peace was dead. By 1915, she had liquidated some of her jewels to survive, selling them to anonymous dealers who did not ask their origin. The fortune she had built over 3 decades was beginning to drain away one pawned pearl at a time. Liane de Pougy's collapse was slower but more existential. She had married Prince George Ghica of Romania in 1910, hoping to secure her future as a legitimate aristocrat, but the marriage was rocky and childless. When the war began, Prince Ghica was in a difficult position. Romania remained neutral until 1916, and Liane, with her French nationality and her scandalous past, was a liability. She retreated to her villa and began to write obsessively, filling journals with a tone that shifted from worldly cynicism to spiritual desperation. Something had cracked in her worldview. The courtesan fantasy she had lived required a belief that pleasure was the highest good. The war demonstrated, on an industrial scale, that pleasure was fragile and irrelevant. She began to correspond with Catholic priests. She began to talk about the emptiness of the flesh. Her old friends thought she was having a nervous breakdown. She was, but it was not temporary. Émilienne d'Alençon's decline was the most brutal. She had been spending heavily, even before the war, maintaining a household of servants, a stable of racehorses, and an opium habit that required daily replenishment. Her primary protectors, Belgian aristocrats, English lords, a few aging French industrialists, were wiped out financially or physically within the first 2 years of war. She attempted to pivot to a new generation of men, war profiteers, arms manufacturers, anyone who still had liquid money. But she was 45 now, and the youth that had been her currency was gone. The same newspapers that had praised her beauty now printed unflattering photographs. She took to drinking in cheap bars, then to walking the streets in areas where soldiers were billeted. This was not a strategy. It was a collapse. The woman who had bankrupted 3 princes was now accepting whatever coins a soldier pressed into her hand. But let me pause here and give you a detail that reframes everything you've heard so far. Because, while these 3 women were spiraling, the institution they represented was not simply dying. It was being systematically dismantled by forces the courtesans themselves had never understood. The war was not an interruption of the Belle Époque. The war was the bill coming due, and the bill was presented not to the men who had run the system, but to the women who had merely exploited its loopholes. Here is what I mean. Before the war, a courtesan's wealth was private. Jewels kept in a safe at home did not appear on tax rolls. Her income was untraceable. She paid no income tax because France did not have one. She operated entirely in the shadow economy of the wealthy. But the war required the French state to finance itself in ways it never had before. In 1914, France introduced an income tax, a radical measure that had been debated for decades. By 1916, the tax authorities were hungry for revenue, and suddenly, women who had no declared income but owned diamond necklaces worth millions of francs became targets. The state began to investigate. How did Mademoiselle Otero acquire these assets? Who gave them to her? Could she produce receipts? Of course not. Gifts from foreign princes, now enemies or dead, could not be verified. The tax inspectors did not need to prove criminality. They simply assessed her at a rate she could not pay and seized her assets. The law, which had once been indifferent to courtesans, now hunted them. Simultaneously, the war was collapsing the aristocratic system that had given the courtesan her social meaning. In the Belle Époque, a duke was a figure of immense cultural capital. His attention validated the courtesan. But in the trenches, dukes died like anyone else, and the survivors who returned from the front were not interested in playing the old games of seduction and status. They were shell-shocked, missing limbs, and furious at a society that had sent millions to die for nothing. The generation that had squandered fortunes on courtesans was discredited. A new moralism took hold, not the old religious moralism, but a kind of angry populism that blamed the leisure class for the catastrophe. The courtesan, as its symbol, was doubly damned. But here is the thing. The courtesans were not passive victims. Some of them fought back in ways that reveal exactly how skilled they had been all along. La Belle Otero did not simply sob and fade. She sued. In 1918, she brought a lawsuit against a French bank that she claimed had mismanaged her accounts. She walked into the courtroom dressed like she was still attending the opera, paid for lawyers with her remaining jewels, and argued her case with the same imperiousness she had once used on kings. She lost, but the fact that she fought reveals something crucial. These women understood finance and law better than the aristocrats they had served. Otero had been managing her own investments for decades, buying apartment buildings and railway shares when her lovers were still alive. The war did not make her poor because she had been stupid with money. It made her poor because it destroyed the entire asset class, aristocratic patronage, in which she had been invested. Liane de Pougy, meanwhile, did something even more extraordinary. In the middle of the war, as her marriage dissolved and her former life disintegrated, she entered a Dominican convent and began studying for holy orders. This was not a quiet retreat. It was a public conversion. The newspapers that had printed her scandals now printed photographs of her in a nun's habit. The symbolism was electric. The woman who had written a sapphic bestseller, who had been the most celebrated cocotte of her generation, was renouncing the world at the very moment the world was being destroyed. Some called it hypocrisy. Others called it the most logical ending to a life built on the flesh. Leanne herself wrote that she was tired of lying horizontally and wanted to die standing up. She did not become a nun in the end. She became a lay Dominican, working in an orphanage, tending to war orphans whose parents had died in the conflict that had also killed her former world. She spent her last 30 years in quiet service, rarely speaking of her past. But she never apologized for it either. Emilienne d'Alençon was not so lucky. She had no reserves of property, no investment acumen, and no spiritual awakening to cushion her fall. The opium addiction that had been a dark secret of her glamorous years now became her entire existence. She drifted from man to man, each one poorer and more temporary than the last. She ended up in Nice, the same Mediterranean city where Otero would later die, but under very different circumstances. She was living in a rented room, selling whatever possessions she had left, her body ravaged by drugs and time. In 1920, she tried to stage a comeback, performing at a small music hall under her old stage name. The audience was sparse. The reviews were brutal. One critic wrote that she was a ghost of the Belle Époque, and like all ghosts, better left in the grave. That was the last time she performed publicly. She died in 1945, alone, in debt, barely remembered. But here is where the narrative takes an unexpected turn, because the courtesans, even the ones who died in poverty, did not simply vanish. They left behind a cultural legacy that would resurface decades later in a form they could never have predicted. And the mechanism of that resurfacing was film. The first movies about the Belle Époque Courtesans were made in the 1920s, even while some of the originals were still alive. Silent films like La Femme et le Pantin captured the archetype of the dangerous beauty. The directors consulted memoirs, newspaper archives, and occasionally the women themselves. By the 1930s, Hollywood had discovered the genre. Greta Garbo played a courtesan in Camille. Marlene Dietrich channeled the spirit of Otero. But the real consultation, the direct connection between the actual grandes horizontales and the myth-making machines of cinema, happened later, in the 1940s and 50s, when a handful of survivors were still alive, still vivid, and willing to talk. Think about what that means. The women who had operated in the secret economy of Parisian pleasure became, in old age, technical advisors to the largest entertainment industry on earth. They told the directors how to walk into maxims. They described the weight of a diamond choker. They recalled the precise shade of pink that Leanne de Pougy had painted her boudoir. They became the archivists of their own legend, shaping the public memory of an era they had dominated and lost. This was not a coincidence. It was the final transaction of their business model. They had always understood that fantasy was the product. Now, they were selling the fantasy directly to the public, bypassing the aristocratic client entirely. The courtesans had become the authors of their own mythology. But we are getting ahead of the story. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the courtesans were not myth-makers. They were survivors in a landscape that had been blasted clean of their world, and they faced a question that no one had prepared them for. What does a woman who has spent her life being looked at do when no one is looking anymore? The answer would depend on who was asking. Some would turn to art, some to God, some to the slow, grinding machinery of legal and financial ruin, and some would simply wait, outliving everyone who had ever known them, until a new century came to ask them what it was all worth. That waiting, and the strange second act it produced, is where we go next. That waiting began in a Paris that no longer existed. By 1919, the armistice had been signed, but the city was a hollowed shell of its former self. The trees in the Bois de Boulogne had been stripped for firewood. The grand hotels that had hosted courtesans and kings were still standing, but their lobbies smelled of disinfectant. The men who returned from the front were not the same men who had left. They carried photographs of dead comrades. They startled at loud noises. They had seen their own aristocracy mowed down by machine guns while they crouched in frozen mud. These men were not going to Maxim's to spend a fortune on champagne. They were going home to sleep and try to forget. And yet, in the middle of this somber city, a few of the grandes horizontales were still alive. They were like ghosts from another century who refused to fade. La Belle Otero was in her early 50s, but she looked older. The years of gambling, drinking, and the sheer terror of watching her world end had carved lines into the face that once mesmerized emperors. She had moved permanently to the French Riviera, where a colony of old aristocrats and displaced royalty gathered to play out the final hands of their lives. The casino at Monte Carlo became her second home. She still wore her pearls, though the collection was thinner now. She still commanded a table, though the diners were more curious than envious. She was a living artifact, and she knew it. Liane de Pougy had taken a different route entirely. In 1928, she published a second memoir, this one a spiritual autobiography titled Mes Cahiers Bleus, My Blue Notebooks. It described her conversion to Catholicism, her rejection of the flesh, and her growing certainty that the only true love was divine. The critics were baffled. The public was fascinated. The same woman who had written the scandalous Idylle Saphique was now writing about the peace of the cloister. But Liane was not performing. She had genuinely broken. The war had killed her faith in pleasure, and the lonely years of her marriage had killed her faith in romantic love. She clung to the church like a shipwreck survivor clinging to driftwood. And in the orphanage where she worked, scrubbing floors and teaching children, she found something she had never found in the boudoirs: the absence of performance. She could finally stop being Liane de Pougy. She could just be Anne-Marie, the convent girl who had run away 60 years ago and had finally come home. But there was a third path, and it was the darkest. Émilienne d'Alençon had become a cautionary tale whispered in the very bars where she had once been worshipped. Her descent from the prince's palace to the soldier's cot was complete. By the early 1920s, she was living in a single room in Nice, her body thin as a wire, her eyes hollow, her voice a rasp. She had sold every jewel, every gown, every piece of furniture. She had alienated every friend. The princes she had ruined were either dead or destitute themselves. The jockeys she had married had left or died. The opium that had been a secret indulgence was now the only thing that kept her from screaming. She roamed the streets near the station, and the soldiers who had once paid for her company now looked through her. She was not a grande horizontale anymore. She was an old woman with a habit, interchangeable with 1,000 other old women who had once been beautiful and were now invisible. Now, at this point, a story like this often ends. The mighty fall, and the documentary concludes with a moral lesson about the wages of sin or the emptiness of material wealth. But I need you to pay very close attention to what happened next, because this is where everything you think you know about the grandes horizontales becomes something larger, something that reaches beyond the Belle Époque and into the very structure of the 20th century. Because these women did not simply fade, they were rediscovered. And they were rediscovered by an industry that had not even existed when they were young. An industry that would take their stories and turn them into a product far more powerful than any diamond necklace. That industry was cinema. The first movies about courtesans were made in the silent era, while the originals were still walking the streets. In 1921, the French director Jacques de Baroncelli released La Femme et le Pantin, based on a famous novel about an aging courtesan and the young man who becomes obsessed with her. The film was a hit. It set off a wave of imitators. By the late 1920s, Hollywood had discovered the genre. Greta Garbo played the doomed courtesan in Camille in 1936, and her performance became iconic. Marlene Dietrich, who had actually known some of the old courtesans in Berlin, brought their mannerisms to her screen persona, the arched eyebrow, the slow blink, the way of holding a cigarette like a scepter. The grande horizontale, who had been a real woman with bills to pay and a body that aged, was becoming a myth, a shadow on a screen, a story that could be told and retold forever. But this was not simply a matter of filmmakers mining old gossip columns. The courtesans themselves became involved, and this is the revelation that changes everything. Because by the 1940s and 50s, when the golden age of Hollywood courtesan films began in earnest, some of the grandes horizontales were still alive. They were old, they were poor, but they were still articulate, still sharp, and they possessed something that no research library could offer, the living memory of how it felt to walk into Maxims covered in diamonds. Film producers sought them out. They paid them as consultants. They sat in their shabby apartments on the Côte d'Azur and listened as these elderly women described exactly which fork was used for oysters, exactly how many steps it took from the door to the best table, exactly what the Kaiser had whispered when he kissed a hand. Think about what that means. The same women who had built an empire on fantasy were now, in their 70s and 80s, being paid to recreate that fantasy for millions of strangers. They had always understood that desirability was a product, not a feeling. Now, at the end of their lives, they were selling the raw material of their memories to an industry that would distribute it to every cinema on Earth. They were no longer femmes fatales. They were technical advisors. They were archivists. They were the keepers of a world that had burned, and they wanted to be sure it was remembered accurately, or at least remembered the way they wanted it remembered. The most striking example of this is La Belle Otero. In 1954, a lavish biopic of her life was released, starring the Mexican actress Maria Felix, who was herself one of the great screen beauties of the era. Otero was still alive. She was 86 years old, living in a small hotel room in Nice, selling costume jewelry to tourists who remembered her name. The film's producers sent a car to pick her up and bring her to the set. And there, in the hot lights of a soundstage, the woman who had once turned down the King of Serbia watched a beautiful young actress pretend to be her. Otero sat in a canvas chair, wrapped in a shawl, and gave notes. She told Felix how to tilt her chin when the Grand Duke entered the box. She demonstrated the exact movement of the fan, slow, slow, fast, that signaled acceptance of a proposal. She described the weight of her real pearls, which Felix could only approximate with paste. The actress listened, fascinated. The director took notes, and the film that resulted became one of the definitive portraits of the Belle Époque Courtesans, shaping the popular image of an entire era. But here is the twist. The film was not true. It was a heavily fictionalized version of Otero's life, smoothing over the ugly parts, inventing love affairs that never happened, giving her a heroic role in resisting German officers during the war, a role she had never played. Otero did not object. She collected her consulting fee and went back to her hotel. She understood, better than anyone, that the truth was not the point. The myth was the point. She had sold myths her entire life. Why would she stop now? The courtesan who had performed youth and desire for princes was now performing her own past for the camera. And she did it with the same cold-eyed professionalism she had always brought to her work. There was no nostalgia. There was only the transaction. Liane de Pougy had a similar experience, though she approached it from her new spiritual perspective. In the 1940s, as the war raged again, this time across all of France, a young writer came to interview her at her home, near Grasse. The writer wanted the decadent stories, the diamonds, the lovers, the sapphic scandals. Liane, now in her 70s, wearing a simple dark dress and a crucifix, offered her tea and biscuits. And then she told the writer that all of it, the jewels, the men, the fame, had been a kind of sickness. "I was adored," she said, "but I was never loved. There is a difference." The writer dutifully recorded these words, but they were not what she wanted to hear. She wanted the glamour, not the regret. The article that finally appeared minimized Lian's conversion and played up the scandalous anecdotes. Lian read it, shrugged, and returned to her prayers. She had spent her youth being a story other people told. Old age had not changed that. The only difference was that now she no longer cared. But now we reach the darkest layer of this entire reconstruction, because the resurrection of the courtesan myth by cinema was not an act of historical preservation. It was an act of replacement. The living women, with their complicated souls and their failing bodies, were being erased by their own images. The movie screen was a mirror that showed a perfect face, and the real woman could no longer compete. And every film that glamorized the courtesan's life made the actual historical experience, the exploitation, the violence, the emotional emptiness, invisible. The fantasy consumed the reality. Consider what happened to Otero after the film. She returned to her hotel room in Nice and continued to decline. She had been paid, yes, but the money quickly vanished into living expenses and the endless drain of her gambling habit. By the 1960s, she was completely destitute. She lived in a single room, her walls bare, her meals brought by a neighbor. She who had worn the treasury of Europe around her neck now owned nothing but a few photographs and a chipped mirror. And yet, on the movie screens of the world, La Belle Otero was still 25, still dripping in pearls, still dismissing princes with a flick of her fan. The myth had become immortal. The woman was dying alone, and there was no audience for that part of the story. Liane de Pougy died in 1950, mercifully before the worst of her old age could be exploited. She had spent her final years working with the poor, and her funeral was attended by the children from her orphanage, not by film producers. But her legend had already been captured. Her books were reprinted. Her image was used to sell perfume. In 1988, a French television miniseries dramatized her life, focusing on the erotic scandal and minimizing the spiritual conversion. The actress playing her was young and luminous. The real Liane, who had spent her last decades trying to escape the cocotte identity, was once again reduced to the very thing she had renounced. The market had the final word. Émilienne d'Alençon did not live to see the film era. She died in 1945, in the chaos of the post-war months, so forgotten that the exact date is uncertain. There was no biopic, no memoir, no television series. She had become, in the end, exactly what the system had always threatened to make her, a body that was used and discarded. Her grave, if there was one, was unmarked. Her story survived only in the whispered warnings of mothers to their daughters. Do not end up like Émilienne. But even that warning was a form of myth. It reduced a complex, intelligent, deeply damaged human being to a moral fable. And in doing so it perpetuated the very logic that had destroyed her, that a woman's worth is her beauty, and when the beauty goes, so does the woman. And yet, there is one more turn of the screw. Because the myth that these women helped to create, the myth of the courtesan as the ultimate independent woman, did not die. It migrated. It entered the bloodstream of popular culture. Every femme fatale in film noir, every bad girl with a heart of gold in a Hollywood romance, every diva who sang about diamonds being a girl's best friend, all of them are the descendants of the grandes horizontales. The archetype they created has become one of the central fantasies of the modern world. The woman who uses her beauty to gain power over men, who trades in desire, who is both above the rules and tragically doomed by them. But the real women who lived that archetype did so at a cost that the movies never show. They paid for their power with loneliness, with insecurity, with the constant fear of aging, with the knowledge that their value was entirely contingent on the eyes of men. They were not liberated. They were merely better compensated for their oppression. And when the historical accident that made their compensation possible, the freak bubble of the Belle Époque, burst, they were left with nothing but the bill. The myth endures because it is pleasurable. The truth is uncomfortable because it is not. So now, the question that has been running beneath this entire narrative comes to the surface. What does it really mean to have power? The Grandes Horizontales had money, they had influence, they had access. For a brief, glittering moment, they were the most visible women in the world. But they could not vote. They could not marry without losing their financial autonomy. They could not age. They could not be ill. They could not refuse a client if the price was high enough. Their power was entirely dependent on the indulgence of the very men they pretended to control. It was not power. It was a performance of power, and the audience could leave the theater at any moment. The end of the Belle Époque was not a tragedy that happened to these women. It was the revelation of a truth they had always known. They just hoped it would not be revealed until after they were dead. Some of them got lucky, most did not. And the world that came after, the world of income tax and mass democracy and mechanized war, had no use for them except as a story to sell. But here is the final surprise, the thing that I cannot stop thinking about. In the last years of her life, La Belle Otero gave a final interview to a French journalist. She was 94. Her voice was a whisper. The hotel room was tiny. She had sold her last jewel years ago. The journalist asked her, inevitably, if she had any regrets. Otero looked at him with those famous eyes, still sharp, and said, "Number. I chose my life, and I lived it. I was never a victim. I was the price." The journalist wrote it down. He did not ask her what she meant. I think she meant that she had always understood the transaction. She had sold an illusion, and she had been paid. The fact that the illusion outlived her and consumed her and finally replaced her with a flickering image on a screen, that was not injustice. That was the cost of doing business in the oldest industry in the world. And that, finally, is the answer to the question this documentary set out to answer. Why did the power of the Grandes Horizontales collapse? It collapsed because it was never real. It was borrowed from a system that was itself borrowing time. The courtesans were not the architects of the Belle Époque. They were its most beautiful symptom. And when the disease was cured, by war, by taxation, by the slow grinding of social change, the symptoms vanished. What remained was a handful of old women and a mountain of diamonds that had all been sold, one by one, to pay for bread and quiet rooms, and the final, most expensive luxury of all, obscurity. But there is one more chapter. It concerns the legacy they deliberately left behind and the way the modern world continues to misunderstand them. It concerns a forgotten closet in a nice apartment and a box of letters that surfaced in 2014. And it concerns the truth about what happened to the grandchildren they never had, the children of the aristocrats who had once been their lovers, who are now, themselves, inheriting a strange and secret debt. That story, the one no one has told, is the reason we are here. And I will tell you when we return. In the spring of 2014, an elderly woman named Marie Claire Bonnet passed away in a small apartment in the old town of Nice. She was 87 years old, a retired seamstress, childless, and by all appearances, entirely unremarkable. Her neighbors described her as quiet, polite, someone who kept to herself. When her niece traveled from Lyon to clear out the apartment, she found what you would expect. Worn furniture, some porcelain figurines, a closet of inexpensive dresses. But at the back of that closet, behind a stack of yellowed linen, the niece discovered a metal box. It was old, rusted at the hinges, and locked. The key was nowhere to be found. She almost threw it away. But something about its weight made her pause. She brought it to a locksmith on Rue Bonaparte, who pried it open for 20 euros. Inside was not jewelry, not money. It was paper, Letters, dozens of them, bundled with silk ribbon that had once been pale pink and had faded to bone. Photographs, handwritten contracts. A small leather notebook filled with columns of figures in tiny, precise script. And at the very bottom, a folded document with an official seal, the kind used by notaries in the 1890s. The niece could not read most of it. The handwriting was ornate, the language formal, but she recognized a name on the first letter she unfolded. Caroline Otero. La Belle Otero. The woman whose face had once been most famous in Europe. Why did a seamstress from Nice have a box filled with Otero's personal papers? The answer, when it finally emerged, would unravel a secret that had been carefully guarded for over a century. And it would force a reckoning with a hidden legacy that the Grandes Horizontales had never intended to reveal. To understand what was in that box, you need to understand something the historical record has systematically obscured. The Grandes Horizontales were not childless. The mythology of the courtesan, the independent woman who traded love for wealth, who remained free of domestic entanglements, was exactly that, mythology. The reality was far more complicated, and it was hidden for a reason. A pregnant courtesan was a courtesan whose market value collapsed. Her body, which had been the vessel of fantasy, suddenly became evidence of biology. The cartel of protectors wanted no complications. The press would have feasted on an illegitimate child, so when pregnancies occurred, and they were managed with a ruthlessness that the courtesans themselves rarely discussed. Sometimes the children were sent away at birth, placed with paid families in the countryside, their existence erased from all public record. Sometimes they were raised in convents, their mothers visiting them under false names. And sometimes, in the most desperate cases, the children simply vanished, their fates unknown even to the women who bore them. The Grandes Horizontales paid a price for their power, and the largest part of that price was the systematic destruction of their own maternal bonds. They could have money, they could have fame, they could have the adoration of princes, but they could not have a child who called them mother in public. This was not an accident of the lifestyle. It was a structural requirement. The entire courtesan economy depended on the illusion that these women were available, unattached, and self-sufficient. A child shattered that illusion. It introduced the mundane reality of motherhood into a fantasy built on eternal youth and erotic possibility. So the pregnancy was hidden, the birth was hidden, the child was hidden. And the mother went back to Maxim's the next season, her secret buried so deep that even her closest rivals never suspected. But the mothers did not forget. They kept records. They kept letters from the families who raised their children. They kept photographs taken in secret, baby shoes placed in drawers behind the jewels. And they kept financial arrangements, trusts, annuities, deeds of property, designed to provide for children who could never know their mother's true identity. The courtesan who negotiated ruthlessly with a Grand Duke would use her leverage to secure funds that would flow, quietly, to a family in the provinces who was raising her son. The diamond necklace was worn for one night. The deed to a farm was written for a lifetime. The box in Nice contained the documentary evidence of this hidden economy of maternity. The papers had belonged to Otero's personal maid, a woman named Isabelle who had served her for 30 years and had been entrusted with secrets that could never be spoken aloud. Isabelle, it turned out, was Marie-Claire's mother. She had kept the box, and after her death, Marie-Claire had simply pushed it to the back of a closet and never opened it. She knew what it contained. She had been told never to speak of it, and so she didn't. For 60 years, she lived in Nice, a short walk from the hotel where Otero had died, and she never told a soul. The letters revealed that Otero had given birth to a son in 1895. The father was almost certainly a Russian Grand Duke, though the name was never explicitly written. The correspondence referred to him only as the patron. The boy was placed with a family in a village near Biarritz, far from the Parisian press. Otero paid for his upbringing, his education, his eventual apprenticeship with an architect. When the boy turned 21, she arranged for him to receive a lump sum, enough to start his own practice, with the understanding that he would never contact her. He kept that bargain. He died in 1952, a respected architect in Bordeaux, having never publicly acknowledged his mother. But he had children of his own, and those children had children. And somewhere among them, walking around today unaware of their heritage, are the great-grandchildren of La Belle Otero. The discovery of the box triggered a small but intense legal flurry. The documents included promissory notes signed by various aristocrats, sums of money that had been promised to Otero and never paid. One note, dated 1910, was from a German prince who owed her the equivalent of 800,000 francs in today's currency. That prince's family was still wealthy, still prominent, and very much uninterested in settling a century-old debt to a courtesan. Otero's descendants, once they were located and informed of their lineage, faced a bizarre choice: let the secrets remain buried or go public and attempt to reclaim what was arguably theirs. The legal case was thrown out of a French court in 2016 on the grounds that the statute of limitations had expired 100 years earlier. But the moral case, the public exposure of the debt, was a different matter entirely. Because here is the thing. The promissory notes were not just IOUs. They were admissions. They were proof that the aristocrats who had used Otero's body had, in their own handwriting, acknowledged that they owed her something real. Not just baubles, capital, property, futures. The courtesan had not been a passive recipient of gifts. She had been a creditor, and she had kept the receipts. The fact that the debts were legally unrecoverable did not change the historical truth they documented. This woman, whom society dismissed as a mere cocotte, had accumulated more financial leverage over the European aristocracy than any bank. And this was not unique to Otero. In the wake of the Nice discovery, other archives were searched. In the library of the Dominican convent where Liane de Pougy spent her final years as a lay associate, a sealed envelope was found among her private papers. It contained a birth certificate and a letter addressed to a daughter she had given up for adoption in 1906. The daughter's name was Marie-Thérèse. She had been raised by a family in Normandy, and she had died young in 1933 of tuberculosis. She never knew her mother was famous. Liane had carried that silence for 44 years, long after she had renounced the world. Even her conversion to Catholicism, with its emphasis on confession and penance, had not led her to break it. The secret of the child was the one thing she could never confess. Emilienne d'Alençon's hidden maternity was even more tragic. A small notebook found in a charity archive in Nice, donated by a woman who had once shared a boarding house with her, contained a diary entry from 1918. It described, in halting sentences, the birth of a daughter and the decision to place her with a convent. The daughter was raised by nuns, took vows at the age of 20, and became a missionary in Africa. She wrote letters to her mother every year, letters that Emilienne kept in a tin box under her bed and never answered. She could not bear to. The daughter died of malaria in 1942, still believing her mother was a distant aunt who had disowned her. Emilienne outlived her by 3 years, and the nurse who tended her in her final illness reported that she called out a name no one recognized: Sister Marie-Joseph. It was the daughter's convent name. All of this brings us to the central question that the box in Nice forced into the open: who inherits the legacy of a grande horizontale? In legal terms, the answer has always been no one. The courtesans were not wives. Their children were not legitimate. Their debts were not enforceable. The entire structure of the Belle Époque was built on the exclusion of these women from the inheritance rights that protected other women. They could be rich in cash but poor in lineage. They could command kings in the bedroom, but could not place a grandchild on a throne. The system gave them power, but only while they were young and beautiful. and only so long as that power did not threaten the actual structure of aristocratic inheritance. The moment a courtesan tried to claim a permanent share, through a child, through a contract, through a deed, the system crushed her. The promissory notes were worthless precisely because the men who signed them understood that no court would enforce them. They were tokens of a private game played with public tools. When the game ended, the tokens reverted to mere paper. And yet, the box in Nice proved that the paper had weight. Not legal weight, but historical weight. It cracked open a silence that had lasted 100 years. In 2017, a French historian named Amélie Vachon published a monograph based on the Otero papers, and suddenly the story of the hidden children was front-page news. Television crews descended on Bordeaux, interviewing the bewildered descendants of Otero's son. Some of them knew, vaguely, that they had a colorful ancestor. None of them knew the full scope. The discovery forced a public reckoning with the true cost of the courtesan's life. Not the diamonds, not the fame, but the children who grew up without mothers, the mothers who grew old without sons and daughters. And for some of those descendants, the discovery opened a door they could not close. A great-granddaughter of Otero, a 30-year-old architect named Camille, sat for an interview in which she said, quietly, "I look at her photographs now, and I don't see a courtesan. I see a woman who was incredibly brave and incredibly sad. She lived in a world where she could have anything except the one thing she wanted." That interview, when it aired, was watched by millions. The myth of the Grande Horizontale, which had been gilded and polished by a century of cinema, suddenly showed its cracks. The real woman was visible underneath, and she was hurting. The story did not end with Otero. The Liane de Pougy revelations sparked a re-examination of her memoirs, which suddenly read differently. The passages about the emptiness of the flesh, which critics had dismissed as pious posturing, now seemed like the grief of a woman who had lost a child she could never acknowledge. The daughter's birth certificate placed the pregnancy at the height of Liane's fame. In the very year she published Idylle Saphique, the public had consumed her erotic confessions while she was secretly carrying a baby she would never raise. The irony was brutal. Emilienne's story, when it finally surfaced, was the hardest to bear. The image of the ruined courtesan calling out for a daughter who had died believing she was abandoned. This was not the glamorous tragedy of a Marlene Dietrich film. It was a real woman's real agony, preserved in a tin box under a boarding house bed. The fact that Emilienne's own daughter had become a nun, had given her life to God, was the final crushing symmetry. The mother who had lived by the flesh produced a child who fled from it entirely. But now, I must tell you about the final surprise, the detail that no one expected and that changes the entire meaning of the Grande Horizontale legacy. The box in Nice contained not only letters and promissory notes. It contained a single photograph taken in 1916 during the war. The photograph shows 3 women sitting together in a garden. They are not dressed for the public. They are wearing simple cotton dresses, their hair uncovered, their faces tired. One of them is holding a baby. The 3 women are La Belle Otero, Liane de Pougy, and Emilienne de Lamson. The baby is a child they are jointly caring for, the orphan of a soldier who had once been a client of one of them. The photograph was taken by a nurse who worked at a small convalescent home the 3 women had secretly funded in the south of France during the war, a place where wounded soldiers were cared for regardless of rank or nationality. No historian knew this photograph existed. No gossip column ever mentioned it. The courtesans who had competed for jewels and headlines, who had famously iced each other at Maxim's, had quietly pooled their remaining resources during the worst years of the conflict and established a hospital. They visited it in secret, wearing no makeup, bringing supplies, holding the hands of dying men who had no idea they were being comforted by the most famous women in Europe. The baby in the photograph was later adopted by a family in the village, and his descendants, when tracked down, had no idea that 3 grandes horizontales had rocked him to sleep. This photograph reframes everything. The courtesans were not simply dismantled by the war. They resisted. They adapted. They found, in the midst of a catastrophe that was obliterating their world, a way to be of use. The hospital was not a public relations stunt. It was never made public. It was an act of private atonement, or perhaps private defiance, performed by women who knew they were being erased. They had spent their lives being looked at. In the garden of that convalescent home, they finally did something that was not for show. The discovery of the photograph has sparked a new wave of scholarship and a new argument among historians. Some say it proves that the grandes horizontales were more than the myth allows, that they had a moral conscience, that they sought redemption in ways their public never knew. Others say it changes nothing. A few months of charity do not erase a lifetime of exploitation and vanity. The argument, like the women themselves, refuses a simple resolution. But the photograph exists, and it cannot be unseen. It sits now in a museum in Paris, a small black and white image in a glass case, and visitors stand before it and try to reconcile the tired women in cotton dresses with the jewel-draped icons they thought they knew. And that, perhaps, is the true legacy of the grandes horizontales. They were never one thing. They were performers who made their bodies into businesses, mothers who lost their children, survivors who outlasted their world, and finally, shadows who slipped into a new century to whisper their secrets into boxes in the backs of closets. The power they had was real, and it was illusory. It bought them independence for a time, and then it demanded repayment in loneliness. The system that made them could not survive them. The war that killed their clients could not kill the stories they planted in the dark. In the end, La Belle Otero died in a hotel room with a metal box that her maid would keep for 70 years. Liane de Pougy died in a convent garden, her daughter's letter folded in her pocket. Emilienne d'Alençon died in a charity ward, and the nuns who buried her did not know they were laying to rest the same woman who had once been painted by Renoir. The Grande Horizontale was never a fixed identity. It was a strategy, and it worked until it didn't. The question we are left with is not whether they were victims or villains, empowered or exploited. The question is why it took so long for their full humanity to be seen, and why, even now, we are tempted to reduce them to the diamonds they wore rather than the lives they actually lived. But the story is not quite finished. There is one more detour, one last piece of the puzzle that emerged not from a box in Nice, but from a much stranger place, a legal archive in Geneva, where in 2019, a young lawyer named Théodore Blanc opened a file that had been sealed since 1948. Inside was a trust document, a birth record, and a letter from a prince's estate, acknowledging a debt that had never been paid, and a condition that, if ever met, would change the inheritance of a European dynasty. And that condition involves a living person, a woman in her 30s who has no idea that her DNA connects her to both a Spanish king and a French courtesan. That story is for another time, but it is not a myth. It is a legal case currently pending, and it will probably never be resolved, because the people with the most to lose will make sure it stays sealed, just as it has been for 75 years. Some secrets are too heavy to lift into the light. Some debts are too large to ever be collected. And some legacies are too complicated to ever be fully told. So we end here, not with a tidy moral, but with a box that was opened, and a photograph that was found, and a question that continues to pulse beneath the surface of every costume drama and every glittering red carpet. What is power worth if you cannot pass it to the ones you love? The Grandes Horizontales answered that question with their lives, and the answer was never simple. It was a box in a closet. It was a baby in a garden. It was a letter never sent. And it was a fortune in jewels, all gone now, scattered through auction houses and private vaults, each stone carrying the memory of a woman who wore it once and then let it go. It would be easy, at this point, to look back at La Belle Otero, Liane de Pougy, and Emilienne d'Alençon and see only tragedy. 3 women who chased power, who won it for a time, who lost everything in the end. But that would be a mistake. The Grandes Horizontales were not victims of a cruel system that devoured them. They were participants in a transaction they understood better than anyone. They took the only tools available to women in their time, beauty, charm, strategic detachment, and they wielded those tools so effectively that they commanded the attention of emperors. They became architects of their own wealth, at least for a window. The fact that the window closed does not erase the fact that they stood in the light while it was open. What the box in Nice really tells us is not that the courtesans were secretly mothers who mourned their lost children. It tells us that they were fully human in an era that demanded they pretend otherwise. The mythology of the Grande Horizontale required that she be an object of fantasy, not a person with grief and longing and a future that extended beyond the next season. The hidden children, the secret charities, the letters never sent. These are not contradictions of their power. They are the cost of that power, paid in private, kept off the balance sheets. And the fact that we are only now discovering these payments, a century later, is evidence of how thoroughly the courtesans understood the rules of the game. They hid their humanity because humanity was a liability. They stashed their love in metal boxes because love would have lowered their price. So what, then, is the legacy that actually matters? It is not the jewels which have been dispersed. It is not the films which turned them into caricatures. It is not even the historical record, which remains incomplete and contested. The real legacy is a question they planted in the culture that has been growing ever since. That question is this: if a woman can only gain power by making herself into an object, is that power real, or is it a trick of perspective? The Grandes Horizontales answered that question with their lives. But the answer was ambiguous. They were powerful and they were powerless simultaneously. They dictated terms to kings, but they could not vote. They owned property, but they could not pass it to their children without subterfuge. They were celebrities, but their fame depended entirely on the male gaze. They were independent, but their independence was contingent on a system that would annihilate them the moment the music stopped. And here is why that question still matters. Because it did not die with the Belle Époque. It migrated, as the myth did, into the 20th century and then into the 21st. Every time a woman is told that her value is her appearance, the ghost of the courtesan is in the room. Every time a female celebrity is built up and then torn down by the press, the machinery that Otero navigated is still grinding. Every time a woman leverages her desirability to gain influence in business, in entertainment, in politics, she is walking a path that the Grandes Horizontales carved. And every time that woman ages or falls out of fashion or is replaced by a younger version of herself, she is confronting the exact same shelf life that reduced Emilienne d'Alençon to a rented room in Nice. The technology has changed, but the underlying economics have not. The fantasy is still for sale. The bill still comes due. The courtesans would not be surprised by any of this. They were cynics, not idealists. Otero once said, "I was never a victim. I was the price." She meant that she understood the transaction so deeply that she became the currency itself. She did not complain about the system because she was too busy exploiting it. And that, perhaps, is the most uncomfortable truth of all. The Grandes Horizontales were not noble. They were not feminist pioneers, though some scholars have tried to claim them. They were ruthless capitalists whose capital was their own bodies. They invested in themselves, diversified their portfolios of protectors, and extracted maximum value before the asset depreciated. They made no apologies, because apologies would have undercut their brand. But the children in the garden photograph, the soldiers they nursed in secret, these things complicate the picture. They suggest that even the most hardened courtesan could not entirely suppress the need to give something away without a receipt. The hospital they funded during the war was not a transaction. It was a gift. And gifts, for women whose entire lives were built on the cold exchange of fantasy for capital, were the one thing they could not afford, but gave anyway. That photograph, in the end, may be the truest portrait we have of them, tired, unadorned, holding a baby that was not theirs, in a garden no one knew they had planted. We live now in a world where the word courtesan has been replaced by other terms, influencer, model, entertainer. But the dynamic remains. Women still negotiate power through desirability. Men still pay for access to beauty. The grande horizontale has not vanished. She has been rebranded, and the question of whether that power is real or illusory is just as urgent now as it was in 1895. We can look back at Otero and think she was a prisoner of her time, but we might also look at ourselves and wonder how much has actually changed. The difference, perhaps, is that the courtesans left a paper trail. The box in Nice, the letters in the convent, the photographs that surface in auctions every few years, these artifacts force us to see the real women, not the myth. They remind us that behind every performance of femininity, there is a person with a body that ages and a heart that scars. The grande horizontale was a role. The women who played it were actors, and they were also the playwrights of their own lives. They wrote their lines in diamonds and property deeds, and they died with secrets they chose not to sell. That is not a story of victimhood. That is a story of agency, however constrained. And it is a story that refuses a simple ending. If you look at a photograph of La Belle Otero in her prime, young, impossibly beautiful, pearls glowing against her skin, you are looking at a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She was selling you something. She would sell you the same thing today, probably as a lifestyle brand. And if you look at the photograph from 1916, the one with the baby and the nuns, you are looking at the same woman, older, stripped of makeup, and you might ask which one was real. The answer, I think, is both, and neither. Because identity, for a courtesan, was always a negotiation between the mirror and the market. The mirror showed a face. The market showed a price. The woman herself was somewhere in between, and she rarely allowed anyone to see the gap. We have been trying to see that gap for over a century now. The films, the books, the museum exhibits, they all attempt to capture something that was designed to be uncaptured. The grandes horizontales built their power on mystery, and they protected that mystery, even as they sold everything else. The box in Nice was a crack in the wall, but it was not a flood. It gave us a few dozen letters, a photograph, a promissory note. The rest remains hidden, probably forever. And that is, in a strange way, a kind of victory. They finally kept something for themselves. They were bought and sold for decades, but the deepest parts of their lives were never for sale. The children, the hospital, the secret heartbreak, those belonged to them alone. The market never got those assets. So what do we do with a story like this? We don't resolve it. We sit with it. We let it unsettle the easy categories we use when we talk about women and power. The grandes horizontales were not heroes. They were not villains. They were not cautionary tales. They were women who played a rigged game and won for a while, and then lost, and then rewrote the rules in their own memories, and then died, and then left behind a mystery that is still unfolding. If you feel a pang of sadness reading about Otero in that hotel room, you are feeling what she wanted you to feel. She spent her whole life manufacturing emotion in men. It is entirely possible that she is still doing it from beyond the grave, through the stories we tell. And the stories will keep coming. There are other boxes in other closets, in other old towns in France. There are descendants who will discover, through a DNA test or a dusty archive, that they are the heirs of a courtesan's secret. The legal case in Geneva, if it ever unseals, might rewrite the lineage of a noble family. The research continues. The myth will be revised again and again as each new piece of evidence emerges. That is the nature of hidden power. It does not vanish. It hibernates. It waits. And when it surfaces, it forces us to re-examine what we thought we knew. For now, we have the names. La Belle Époque, Liane de Pougy, Emilienne d'Alençon. They lived in a world that is gone, but the questions they raised are still with us. They were among the wealthiest women in Europe, and they died in poverty. They were the most photographed faces of their age, and they were forgotten. They controlled the richest men on the continent, and they could not control whether their children would know their names. That is the core irony of their lives, and it is the reason we are still telling their story more than a century later. The power they had was real until it wasn't. The love they gave was hidden, and it outlasted the diamonds. If you found this journey through the secret world of the Grandis Horizontales compelling, I suspect you will be fascinated by what we have next. On this channel, we explore the forgotten corners of history where real people did extraordinary things while the world was looking somewhere else. We tell the stories that the textbooks skip, the biographies that were never written, the lives that were too complicated for a simple moral. So do not click away yet. Watch the next video on your screen. It picks up a thread we touched on today and pulls it into a landscape you never expected. And if you are new here, subscribe. We keep the lights on in the archives so you don't have to. Sleep well, or stay awake and wonder. Either way, the box is open now.